Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2020 US Rowing Convention. I'm Deb Ehrenberg, US Rowing Adaptive Program Development Manager. This next speaker is Ellen Minzner, and she's going to speak with us about the US Para Rowing Team. Please use the question and answer section to post your questions. And at the very end, if there are a lot of questions that we can't get to, I will post a Q&A doc that you can put those questions into, and we'll get them answered by Ellen and share those questions and answers with all the attendees. Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you could start by just telling us a bit about you, your rowing history, and how the heck you got into para rowing.
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, though, Deb, I really want to thank you for moderating today, and thank Jules and Sarah in the background for making all this technology come together, like turning sessions over back to back. I also thank and congratulate the earlier presenters. I thought Judy did a great job on classification, and Alice on fixed seat rigging, which we are still need to know a lot more about. So I really appreciate all the work everybody put into all the sessions. My name is Ellen Minzner, and I was a U.S. national team athlete myself, but I became involved in para rowing when I started coaching the PR3 mixed four. I guess it was still known as the LTA 4 back then, in 2013. I didn't know much about para rowing other than what I had learned at CRI, but I kind of became hooked. It's an amazing group of athletes. Some of them are still in the program, athletes and coaches, as I had the privilege of working with the crew from 2013 through 2018, winning silver medal in the Paralympic Games with these athletes. And it's just been an incredible experience thus far. And also, it's really an incredible time to be part of para rowing. There have been so many changes in the past 10 years, and a few more changes yet to come, that I feel like we're really on the cusp of some really great things. And it's just an honor to be part of the program. I stopped coaching in 2018, and in 2019, I took on the role of para high performance director, in addition to my role at Community Rowing as the director of inclusion and advocacy. Many of you know we have a strong para rowing program there, and began hosting the national team selection camps for the four, and recently named CRI as the U.S. Para National Training Center. But as I said, there's been some major changes over the past few years, and I thought it'd be really important to put those into context, or put the current team into context of some of those changes. So, evolution of international para rowing. Judy mentioned our first Paralympic rowing was in 2008. We had the arms and shoulders, men's and women's singles, the trunk and arms mixed double, and the LTA mixed four. At that time, we didn't really have any other world championship only events. The distance was 1,000 meters. 5 total events with a maximum of 9 athletes. And we have about that same program has survived through the years to what we have now. Briefly, we had an ID mixed four, LTA ID mixed four, but that did not last. I was not really involved in the program at that time. But pretty much the program remained consistent through 2012, same slave events and number of events and number of athletes. First big change, we have the addition of the LTA mixed double, came on board in 2013. So that brings us up to an additional event with 11 athletes. And 2017 was probably the most major change. We're going to 2,000 meters. So prior to that, 1,000 meters had been the standard race distance for international para. And with that change to 2,000 meters, really significant changes happened to the program itself. not just the fact that the athletes now doing the full race distance, which I was a big fan of that. It was not too controversial, but a lot of people did want to stay at the 1,000-meter distance. But for me, I felt that we wanted to make sure that the para athletes were on equal terms with the standards of our sport. So that was a pretty exciting change for the athletes, but it also made for an easier integration for a full world championship program, just from a sheer logistics standpoint. So having the 1,000-meter racing required either an additional starting or finishing platform area, depending on how the race would be won. So that logistical challenge, it made it difficult to have the para events fully integrated into the finals with the other events for practicing and racing. So it really has allowed the World Championship program to highlight the para singles where the open singles are being raced, the para pairs where the open pairs are being raced. So I think in a lot of ways, beyond just the distance, that was a very, very important change in the evolution of international para rowing. Another big change came about in 2018 and 2019, where we had a big influx of events. We added PR3 men's and women's pairs and PR2 men's and women's singles. So these events are intended to impact the development of the Olympic events. So the men's and women's pairs would help develop the four or help countries begin to put sweep boats out if they didn't have a full enough squad to field a four. The PR2 singles will help develop the Paralympic event, the PR2 mixed double. And the PR3 double is still in the program, but it doesn't yet have a pathway toward the Olympics. So it originally came on and maybe was intended to help develop athletes for the four, but it really is slightly different based on that higher level of disability that's required to be in the PR3 mixed double. To the point where now, if I'll just jump down a bit lower on the slide there, the PR3 mixed double is on the agenda, not yet approved for inclusion in the 2024 games. I think this is tremendously exciting for the development of para rowing, particularly because with the PR3 mixed double being in the Olympic program potentially, that really does allow for athletes in the PR3 class who are in the above the knee amputee category. Judy mentioned this in her presentation, meaning that the athletes, they have to have a higher level disability to be in this event. And that effectively can be a real obstacle to them actually making the PR3-4, which prior to this would be the only pathway to the Olympics. So when we think about someone with a limb loss of that significance, we feel like that is almost, we expect to see that, that level of athlete at the Paralympic Games. And it would be great if we have a pathway for that to happen. So that's an exciting development that I think will be really really great for the U.S. and for the sport in general. I noted that in this 2021 we have a bit of an anomaly because of the postponement of the Paralympic Games. Puts us into 2021, which is already into the quadrennial cycle with a full World Championships already slated. So, you know, if we were to send a full team to the Paralympic Games and to the World Rowing Championships, we could be looking at, you know, working with a maximum of 24 athletes, which is somewhat unprecedented for para rowing. And, you know, it just shows the growth of the sport, the potential of the sport. And again, I think shows how exciting this really is for para rowing. And Deb, feel free to hop in with any questions there. I'm going to move to sort of show where the U.S. has performed over these events in the last several years, if there aren't any questions. I know There's a lot of history in there, Deb.
Yeah, you had touched on COVID, and one of the questions that you've received is what particular impact COVID has had on the para team and
Sure.
what special protocols you've put in
Sure.
place.
Yeah. I thought about doing the whole presentation on that, quite frankly. There's a lot that goes into it. First of all, the impact on an athlete whose whole world revolves around goal setting and that time frame about when is that event. Very disappointing, because not only we had the games postponement, we also had another postponement with the selection for the PR3 Mixed 4 was supposed to take place in January this year. We were all excited about that, an early selection, more time together. And we just a couple of weeks ago had to postpone that to June, which we think we should be very solid footing on. But I think the mental aspect of the postponement of the games has been very hard. We went into remote training slightly earlier in Boston than the shutdown, recognizing that athletes with disabilities may have a little bit higher risk to be exposed. So we sent ergs home with athletes pretty early in March. And that's where they've been training for the most part until we opened up in the summer.
Awesome.
The other thing is we all had to switch from team boat rowing to single rowing, and that's not always easy, since especially in the PR3 category, we're dealing with athletes with significant asymmetry. So shifting to single sculling like all the other national teams, making sure we had our operations were all outdoor, going through the standard state COVID protocols, and making sure athletes had the means to train fully at home. And that meant their specialized equipment, in their apartment or home, wherever they were.
Ellen, we have another question. What has been the age range of the athletes? And I think you have a slide coming up on that. All right.
Yeah, I actually I jumped in without letting you know what I was going to talk about. I have an agenda here that I'll go over quickly, and maybe that will let you know some of the things that we will touch on. So first, we're going to put it in historical context, which I've done here. Second, I'm going to summarize the trends, generally speaking, of a U.S. team performance in these events. Give an overview of what the typical athlete is, erg score, age range, etc., in the PR 1, 2, and 3 categories. Give you an idea of the type of training that we do out of the training center in Boston, and close with some priorities of what I think are important things we want to put in place to be successful in LA 2028. That's going to be a big one with Olympics back on our home soil, and we really want to develop an outstanding program for that, even better than what we have right now, and of course take questions. So I will touch upon that age issue across each of the categories a little bit later, if we can just kind of move on. So U.S. paranational team medals, we've had some good success early on. Obviously, first Olympic Games, 2008, we had a silver in the LTA 4, as well as a bronze in the women's single. So it's pretty exciting. I show this gap because we're talking about the medals in terms of just overall performance. U.S. always top 8 performer in many of these categories. Generally A-level finals, a handful of 4th and 5th place finishes across all the categories, but not real medal success again until we get into 2012. That was Rob Jones and Oksana winning a bronze medal in the PR2 mixed double. The year after the games, we had our only Paralympic medal was the PR3 mixed double, and as I mentioned, that's a world championship event. So we don't get back into a medal in the Paralympic event until the 2014 World Championships. And then as you see, looking down the medal count, the PR3 have done quite well over the years. And we want to, why is that? What happened in 2014? Well, for the most part, young athletes, college and high school, came out for the team and stayed with the team. So in 2014, we had 2 high school athletes in addition to predominantly collegiate athletes. coming into the system. We had a high number of athletes trying out for the team in 2014. I think we had 12 athletes at camp. So, traditional seat racing, 3 boats across, was very exciting. But that continued performance of the PR3 is really about athletes being able to emerge from competitive club and collegiate systems. We did have a medal in the women's single again in 2018, but for the most part, the medals have come from predominantly athletes with prior competitive experience. I think that's a very important point to make. So we want to say, who are these athletes? Where are they coming from? Like, how do we do this? So I put together this little montage because I think it's a little bit different view of what we might think of as para rowing, and it's all over the map. I love the top photo because actually in that photo we had all single scullers. This is pre-COVID. I just want to make that clear. We took a photo at the training center in Chula Vista. We've got PR1, PR2, and PR3 all represented here. It's a great group of athletes to work with. So this is just some photos that we have of some current team members. But I want to say a little bit about what the typical profile is for some athletes, at this level. So as I said, the PR3, they are mainly coming from competitive club and collegiate experience, and this is somewhat by design or backwards by design. So some of these athletes are enjoying a competitive career either in their high school or college program without even realizing that they have the disability. So they may have started rowing and noticed that they have a limitation in the range of motion, and the athlete's coach may notice something and they reach out, and it's sort of like they row first and discover para rowing second. Or the athlete, we have one athlete, actually a couple of athletes in the system where they are rowers and either become injured or develop a visual impairment that's progressive enough to the point where they may have started their career as a fully able-bodied athlete, and over time the vision regresses to become eligible as a blind or a PR3 visual impairment, PR3 VI athlete. We also have a couple of athletes develop conditions or have an injury as an athlete that is significant enough that it makes them eligible for Paralympic competition, but not so significant that they would move into one of the more pronounced categories, such as the PR2 or the PR1. Someone asked about age ranges, and across all the PR3 categories, I have a couple of them represented here on the slide. The top is the 4, where you can see from the side, it's not going to look any different from any other Club 4 that you might see. The athletes are rowing a full range of motion. The equipment is not really any different. There are some minor equipment adjustments we'll talk about later, but none of those are required. They're all just ones that may enhance performance or comfort or grip, etc. But the age range is a little bit different across the events. So we put the age range as about 19 to 46. And while that might look very big, if you break it down by event, the age range for the 4, as I said, the athletes are young, they're coming out of college. Age range is probably average about 23 years. We have one athlete just graduated college, a few years out of college. And we have some 7-year veterans in the team, but still, maximum age, and I think going out for the 4 is about 27 years of age. Men's PR3 pair are very competitive, but have a master's age eligibility, so they're in their 40s. The double has an athlete who's in the 30s. So it kind of varies event to event, but the PR3 for the Paralympic event for PR3 currently is mainly younger athletes fresh from college experience, almost to the point where I think it'd be quite difficult to make a successful Paralympic campaign for the 4 without a strong collegiate or club background in competitive rowing. You can see by the erg scores, they're pretty competitive. These are just general estimates of top scores over the last couple of years. So the men's top scores are down near 609, so that's becoming quite good. Women's 720, although we've had a few scores better than that over the years. But roughly speaking, that's about where we're looking at for the PR3 for the 4. Just another thing to point out, the coxswains do not need to have any eligible impairment to compete. So that's kind of a thing that maybe most people don't know. The coxswain in the photo here, competitive experience at University of Rhode Island. The coxswain need not have any impairment to be able to compete. When you move into the fixed seat category, we're going to see a bigger variety of backgrounds. So we've got the PR2 double, which is the Olympic category, very big age range for this category as well. So we've got athletes as young as 18 and age 54 competing. They come from a much more diverse background of rowing experience, so crossover sport. We've got Maddie is the young athlete in the bottom right. She's a crossover athlete from sled hockey, incredible athlete, just kind of still new in her rowing career. We've got Russell Gernal. He is the stroke of the double there, and he's got a swimming background, strong athletic background. Isaac began rowing as his primary sport, and Laura found rowing sort of after becoming involved in almost like at a learn to row level at one of the development camps that we hosted. So a very broad range of athlete background. So my point is here is that you can be successful in this category without having the full background of rowing, but we still want to really develop that within the US system to create more ways where athletes can emerge into the PR2 and the PR1 category. Erg scores fluctuate. The PR2 events are all trials events, so we don't always have a full list of erg scores, but roughly speaking, those are some scores we've seen over the last couple of years. Men's 750 and even lower, much lower, but not in recent times. And women about 816, 820, right around there. Let's see. The PR1, it's a bit of an anomaly. We're really fortunate to have athletes like Blake Haxton and Ron Harvey have the staying power to be involved in more than one Olympic cycle. Blake had rowing experience, prior to his Paralympic campaign. He's an incredible athlete and has the ability, again, to cross over. We have athletes crossing over from other sports into rowing, and Blake has opportunity to also be successful in canoe kayak. So a high level of crossover ability. I forgot to mention Oksana also. She was our PR2 women's sculler in the 2012 games, now a very successful para Nordic skier. So there's a lot of crossover among the sports, and that's an important thing to think about when we talk about the pipeline for how athletes emerge into the fixed seat categories a little bit later in the presentation. The age range now is 27 to 30 for the current team members, and erg scores again a bit varied. Women 918, men roughly 820. So those are the type of erg scores you would see kind of internationally competitive for the US squad right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about elite para training. I listened in on the earlier sessions, and there's some debate about whether para rowing is the PR1 rowing. Is it pick drill rowing? Is it different? But speaking, strictly from a training standpoint, and now that we're at 2,000 meters, let's say para rowing is rowing, and we really adapt when and where necessary. We have found that it's not helpful to make blanket assumptions about, PR1 training has to look like X, or PR1, PR2 rowers should do only X. We have the ability at the training center to really get a lot of eyes on the athletes and make sure we can customize the volume of training that we do, and try and make sure that we do it in the most healthy way. But at the end of the day, a 2,000 meter race is still going to be endurance based. We still have to do a high volume of training, and we look at the overall, not just the race distance, but the time that it would take for the athlete to complete 2,000 meters. And we use their own personal gold medal time standard to make sure we can train toward a very successful race strategy and train the systems that will support that race strategy over a 10 or 11-minute race. I think it's very important. Training is now year round. I think there maybe has some perception that the para team comes together in the summer and they race and they sort of go home after that. That's true, but in order to compete internationally now, I think that the level of competition is very evident in the year prior to the Olympic Games, where the World Championships serve as the qualification for the Games. So in 2019, we fielded a full team of the Olympic and the non-Olympic events, the first time we did that. And all the events are highly subscribed. We have to think about not only competing to make the US team, but what the level of competition is like internationally. And, since the shift from 2,000 meters, the times are getting better, the races are becoming closer, and really it is year-round training, even if you're not located at a training center for the full year. So as we said, the Paralympic 4 is a camp boat, selected traditional selection camp, erg score invites, seat racing, time trial, etc. All of the rest are trials boats. And I think for the most part, most of them, with the exception of Hallie Smith, who is training at the training center in Boston in the fixed seat category, it's just easier for them to train with their home coach in their home environment, but still being in touch with the training and the coaching that we do at different camps or at the training center. But in Boston, 8 to 11 sessions per week, sometimes more. We make some adjustments to the rate and the volume of those steady state sessions. But again, I don't want to limit what the athlete can do. I have evolved myself in how I think about the training for the athletes. The main thing we want to be very careful of is overuse injuries, and injuries that may come about because there is asymmetry. Even in the sculling events, highly bespoke equipment to make sure not only athlete comfort, as Alice mentioned, but also to make sure we can address the asymmetries that may happen even in the sculling events. But overall, 8 to 11 sessions a week, sometimes more. And a typical steady state session, as I said, it's evolved for me. I would not have thought that we would always train the same distance or a similar distance. We do as much by time as we can, but for the most part, we have a woman training in the PR3 category right now, PR2, excuse me, at CRI, who's doing pretty much the same volume as the PR3 athletes. And that means a typical steady state session is 16, 18, 20K. And how is that athlete holding up? Well, she has a small injury right now. I think we're working through it. But for the most part, she's handled it quite well. Erg score dropping and doing a phenomenal job. So overall, it's anywhere between 300, 400 minutes of steady state a week, possibly more. But we have to work within the time constraints of athletes' work and school schedule as much as for the athlete category. So we don't just minimize the volume of steady state based on the category. We base it on the athlete's ability, whether we think we're pushing the envelope too much, whether the athlete has the time to invest in that. I think what's able to make it work is the fact that we have physical therapists on site to check in with the athletes and help us adapt and identify when an athlete may be needing to pull back on their training. Something that's incredibly helpful. I just really thank Jeff and Lisa for working with us. We also started using an athlete readiness form to track metrics. We started doing it in December of 2019, and it was just a Google form. We wanted the athletes to fill it out every day: resting heart rate, hours of sleep, what was their food plan like, and what was their motivation for training that day. So we started out with that questionnaire. I thought they would hate it, but I wanted to get at least a week of baseline. So we made a Google form, made it easy for them to do on their phone. I said, would you please fill this out every day for a week? And after a week, we can decide whether we want to stay with it or not, or whether you think it's too intrusive. And we stayed with it. We just kept filling it out. And it was incredible because we had that baseline. As I said, we pivoted in March pretty quickly to remote training. And because they were used to filling out that daily questionnaire, it was tremendously helpful to have that automated way of checking in with the athletes. That we tweaked it a little bit when we went into COVID, just to make sure that athletes had a way to check in with the coaches. And I'm just so glad we did that. The initial intent was to get a very broad database on each athlete about what the resting heart rate was, whether resting heart rate or hours of sleep correlated to the motivation for training that day, or how they performed on that particular day. I'll admit that we haven't really had the time to fully analyze that data in those exact scientific ways, but we do have that database to more accurately look at the training that they are doing and make sure that they're in the right zone, et cetera. So I think that's been, for us, having those metrics has been incredibly helpful. And I think that the trust that we had built up prior to the sort of pivot to remote training helped us sustain that moving forward. I wanted to sort of stop there. Those are some very broad points about the training. And I didn't know if anyone had any questions at this point, Deb. We can kind of go on a bit if not, but.
Well, we certainly would love to get some questions. Ellen, I thought it might be interesting. We get this question a lot. How do you find your athletes, recruit your athletes? What methodologies have you used at Community Rowing or nationally that might give some other people some help to find athletes for their programs?
Yeah, I think that one of the points we want to make here is that we need some broad-based awareness at and among the collegiate system to help us identify what is, unfortunately right now, well, I wouldn't say unfortunately, but right now it's PR3 athletes that can come through a typical high school and college system. So we're trying to get the word out more to those coaches about what athletes they might already be working with that they might not know have a disability. Because for the most part, coaches will call me and they say, hey, I've got this kid who has a skinny calf and it doesn't really move one of their ankles. Do they have eligibility? So I sometimes say, well, that is kind of, in the PR3 world, that is one of the more likely disabilities that we've seen is fused ankle / club foot, because those athletes, they're going to adapt in some way or or figure out a way to compensate in some way that they can be very successful. Think of Dorian Weber from the 4, Zach Burns from the 4. We have Molly Moore from the PR3 women's pair. I know I'm forgetting a few, but that's a fairly common one across the PR3 athletes, and one where most coaches don't know until they hear a little bit about para. They look at their athletes a little bit differently and they say, wait a second. And that's exactly how we found Molly Moore, and exactly how we found a few other athletes. So in the PR3 category, coaches who have some awareness of para rowing call us, or they have read about it and the athlete finds it by reading about it in Rowing Magazine or what have you. The PR2 and the PR1, it is so varied right now. And that's one of the points I want to make later, is how we, without having to recreate the full college system, I mean, we do have collegiate systems putting in place the para events, the Dadvale Regatta, for example, having para events contested at, that's huge. I still think it will take time for the collegiate system to develop competitive opportunities for the fixed seat category. So how do we find the athletes? We have to look at, I think, ergometer racing, because it's a good because of the crossover capability among the PR1 and the PR2 is a bit higher. We have to look at multi-sport events, Invictus, Warrior Games, on the veteran side, but also on the youth side. Some of these multi-sport events where track and field is way ahead of us in terms of a sport development for young athletes getting into Paralympic track and field. There are opportunities for the sport. There are multi-sport events at that age category. So I wouldn't say I find any athletes. They find us somehow. In Boston, we have a great relationship with Spalding Rehabilitation. I know some of the other prominent adaptive and para rowing programs also have a rehabilitation hospital affiliation. And that's why we see a broader range of athletes coming into those, the PR1 and PR2 category, because they may be introduced even to sport for the very first time by way of a rehabilitation strategy, let alone rowing for the first time as a way of reclaiming their prior athletic experience or being introduced to it. So what I would like to do in the future is to create some more opportunities where athletes can find the sport, find some enjoyment and competitive levels at that in the sport, and then come for the national team. One of the drawbacks of not having a system, and as I said, we're really fortunate for the athletes like a Blake Haxton, who comes ready with that competitive mindset to go. But for the most part, if an athlete finds competitive rowing through a rehabilitation from injury program, and there is very little intermediary for them to build their racing skills, because training and erg score is only one part of it. But how do they develop their racing acumen in order to become ready for their first Paralympic Games campaign? I think that's what we have to look at to find that, because imagine we take a first year rower from one of our squads and send them to the World Championships or even the National Championships as one of their first events, because there's no preliminary events. So I think we are just fortunate that we have coaches who work with athletes at the club level that have the ability to develop an athlete and bring them to the elite level. But we still want to support all athletes and coaches with something a little bit more in between. So that's a really good question.
Great. Ellen, this morning we've talked an awful lot about para rowing and classification. Can you talk a bit about, because you're a huge proponent of this, talk about inclusion rowing? What does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that the Paralympic events themselves, and we may have a new one in 2024, but the events themselves have remained unchanged since 2008. at the games anyway. And we know that already we want to get that double in there because they represent a huge class of athlete, the athlete with a very significant limb loss. And so until we get that in the games, and until we have a real solid pathway to allow for athletes to move up through the ranks of PR1 and PR2 so that they get to that level, we need to have what I call a big tent approach. I want to see athletes with disabilities competing in whatever way is possible and safe for them, because the mere presence of athletes with disabilities makes our regattas better and encourages more participation. So inclusion racing is one way to safely and effectively do that, because there are some athletes for whom rowing a single is not the safest or most effective way for them to participate. But in all other way, it would be a great experience for them. The sport would grow. So inclusion rowing is something we've done at Community Rowing, and is now exist at a handful of fall regattas, the head races, where inclusion is just there's a person without a disability in the boat. You can call it a guide rower or just the other inclusion rower, rowing with a person with a disability. And I just feel like the entry point for competition is a little bit more accessible in that way. We can get more people to race one another and experience that level of competition as a way to develop the competitive skills of the athletes. So I'm a big fan of inclusion, and there's no classification to say what is exactly an inclusion double. But we know that by mixing athletes who have Paralympic eligibility and athletes who don't, we can help elevate the experience of everybody. We can create more entries and therefore more competition. And I think it's a way we can develop that skill set of racing even prior to having a full collegiate system that will help feed the fixed seat categories. So, inclusion racing, even Deb, I know you're working on some rules that just require accommodation. There are some categories that aren't represented in the Paralympic Games, but for whom would help us round out our domestic program for people with disabilities. A quick example would be someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. That's a very significant coaching and racing challenge currently, yet they don't fit neatly into one of our categories. Let's get them involved in ways that are safe and effective. Let's get them able to compete on some equal playing field and just increase the increased participation, which thereby increases awareness of. If I'm watching a regatta on the banks and oh geez, what is this? Oh, it's a learning opportunity every time we host these events, and we want to host full 6-boat finals or even heats and finals. It would be incredible. We want to get there, and so that we can develop systems that will help athletes emerge into competitive PR1 and PR2 racing in the same way that we have a large number of PR3 athletes competing for a few spots, and that's been feeding the success of the PR3 over the last few years.
Excellent. We've had quite a theme this morning with people interested in rowers with visual impairments. Could you talk a little bit about maybe what's going on at your program? You have the good fortune to be located next to Perkins School of the Blind, where I know you work with athletes, but it would be interesting maybe for some people to hear what are some of the coaching considerations, equipment considerations, technical applications that you might use for coaching athletes with visual impairments?
Yeah, I think, fortunately or unfortunately, like we just try and coach all the athletes until we are sure there's like a full need for any accommodation or equipment or technology. I think that technology could be very exciting right now, especially to introduce it at the youth level. We have athletes with visual impairments who can row singles, and we have to be very aware of the safety considerations there. I'm aware of the some of the remote systems there, where you could either have a coach doing remote steering. That's an exciting possibility. We want to think about how we could introduce that safely into the sport. But for visual impairments, you know, we really rely on the athletes' own ability of what they can and can't do, and give cues where we need to. We have, I think the real challenge is, someone mentioned, I think earlier presentation, is the proprioception and how to describe the feel of the stroke, and describe exactly what we are looking for. Sometimes that has taken a real hands-on approach, where guiding the athlete through the motion has been effective. And I think that's the main thing we need to do, is give the athlete, whose proprioception may be limited, because that the development of that is, I'm not a scientist, but it's linked to your vision. And you know, we need to do a better job at that. But I think the technology could be exciting, and I know there's some stuff out there. We have somebody who's experimenting at our club with some technology for hard of hearing, the remote system where the coach microphone. There are some technical issues with that. We want to make sure it has a good range, and can actually be transmitted depending on how far the coach's launch is from the athlete. So I think the real thing for the visual impairment is we have a high level of coach-athlete ratio, you know, making sure that that we can give that type of immediate feedback where possible. But I think that technology is kind of exciting there.
We have another question, or two questions. One is, I'm assuming you'd be willing to share your athlete readiness assessment form with everyone.
Yeah, I would actually. I thought about how to do this here, and I didn't want to like get any names on there, and I kind of struggled with whether that would be an interesting slide or not. It's a Google Doc. I am happy to share it. It's easily modified.
Send it out to the attendees. That's.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it's been super helpful, and I think I have over 1,000 responses right now over the 9 or 10 athletes that we work with. So you can see that data can add up, and you know, we have varying levels of compliance with that. Some people have filled it out every single day, even during our on-water training when we were with them. And some athletes are getting back into it now that we're in remote training. But even if you get, say, you know, the athletes filling it out 60, 70% of the time, it's super helpful. And you have to monitor it though, because the athletes got to know that you're looking at it. If they're going to fill it out every day, you got to be looking at it. But absolutely happy to share that.
We can make sure we get that out to the attendees. Another question for you. When are there going to be 8s in para? And I'm assuming that Jamie means probably at the World Championship level and Paralympic level. And what is it going to take? More athletes per event, more inclusion, more fans and supporters out there. What do you think the key is to that? So there's a lot.
You know, my feeling is, whether it's FISA or the Paralympic Games, like, why wait for them? I mean, why wait? You know, we got to do what's good for us. And I'll tell you, we did the same thing. I don't remember, 2016, I think, or 17. We took the head of the Charles and we mimicked the grade 8, and we did the great para 8, and we had athletes from the gold, silver, and bronze medal winning crews at the 2016 games. It was an open event, the Director's Challenge, if you're familiar with the head of the Charles. So it's got to be a mixed 8. So we'd have mixed 8, all para, and we won. So, and all of the athletes, and these are athletes from Great Britain, Canada, and US. The athletes from the other countries were like, thank you so much for doing this. That was incredible. So much fun. You know, para rowing has to be fun. You know, in classification, it can be stressful. It can be confusing for an athlete. And if we want rowing to really take off in the para community of para rowing, it's got to be fun. So, you know, don't wait for FISA or for the International Olympic Committee to create an 8. Let's create our own 8s. Let's do this.
That was going to be my wrap up, Ellen. How do you look in your crystal ball and tell us where we're going?
I know. I must have paid you to ask that question, because it is a lot of fun. And the athletes want to have fun. This is a lot of training. And as we mentioned before, if you're not in PR3, it's not like you have a fun club racing schedule to go to every year. we have to have fun. We have to be safe, but it has to be fun, exciting, and compelling for the athletes. So that's why I'm a fan of the Big Ten approach. And if you're in an all para 8 and you really only have 6 athletes and you need to fill another 2, like, let's have the race. Let's not worry too much about when FISA and the Olympic Committee will do what we want them to do. We'll do what we want.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Good note to end on then. Do you have any other comments, Ellen?
Yeah, I have one more thing. I just kind of want to talk briefly, if there's no other questions there, about what we think we want to work on for LA 2028, which we've already touched on a little bit, but unless anyone has any specific questions about.
There is one more for you if you'd like to head it off here. Currently, athletes transition to become para-athletes. Have there been kids that have been born with an impairment that have been introduced to the sport earlier? And what age would you think that's appropriate for them to start rowing?
Yeah, sure. I think we are, I think one of the, if there can be any, positives to come out of COVID is a few things that we had to challenge our assumptions. And I'll say this is true for rowing as well as para rowing. When we move to singles, right, we typically introduce middle school kids at the barge, right? The barge is big. Those oars are big. These kids are little. Are they falling in love with rowing when they come down and learn in our barges? Maybe, I don't know. But we had middle school kids in recreational singles this summer, and I'm not speaking about para right now, and they loved it. And they're coming out for the high school team from our Row Boston program, in even stronger numbers than we've had in the past. So I don't know what too young is. And yes, for sure, we already have athletes. I think Isaac French, I'm not sure when he started. I wish I knew exactly, but he was got involved in rowing as his first sport, from what I know, or his first competitive sport anyway. Started as a young athlete, and I don't know his exact story, but I know he was. I'm not sure if it was from birth or not, but from an early age, he had the disability and became rowing and became competitive rower. So there are those that exist. I don't know what too young is. All I know is everybody's individual, and let's not make assumptions. If there's a 10, 11, 12-year-old athlete that is interested, we're working with a young man right now who's in the 8th grade. He started out at our indoor championship. Super excited about him. He's taking small steps. He's going to be, I'm not sure, PR2 or PR1, probably PR2, but came to it through erging. He's in the 8th grade. He's got super long arms, and he could be somebody that might stay with it for a long time, and that's our hope. And we'll, to get him on the water safely is what we want to do.
Excellent. All right. You want to wrap it up, Ellen?
Yeah. So just a couple of closing points. How are we going to build to LA 2028? As I mentioned, the athletes, whether we see them all the time or not, just because we don't see them doesn't mean they're not training year round. And that's true for the coaches. I mean, hats off to the coaches that have been working with athletes, on a pretty much a volunteer basis over the years, and stayed with these athletes. It's incredible. And we need to have better professional development for the coaches. So we come to the World Championships with a good understanding about what it takes at that level. We need more domestic and international race experience for athletes. And we want to sustain the athlete's ability to stay in the system for more than one Olympic cycle. So that requires some financial support as well as professional development on the coach's side. One thing we want to do with the governance, which is already happening and underway, we want to align the para program goals with USRowing overall. I'm very excited. Probably will happen in January 2021. We have a para high performance committee that will be a sort of bona fide committee of the board, a little bit different version of what we were prior to this. And we want to develop a resilient system that's going to handle coach and athlete turnover without impacting performance. So we want a good body of knowledge, and a high performance committee, I think, will help with that. And as we've been talking about already, is we really need to think about introducing our sport at earlier levels to youth across all categories, but particularly we need more opportunity at the Peer 1 and Peer 2 level. I mentioned aligning with multi-sport events such as Angel City Games, or I think it's called Move United now, but Adaptive Sport USA had a multi-sport youth championship. And as we said, to allow, at least domestically, allow for events that go beyond the Paralympic category so that we can bring more people into the system. So those are some very broad goals that we're trying to work on between now and LA 2028.